is from the Gospel according to Mark, 3rd chapter. And I will be reading verses 31 through 35. Then his mother and his brothers came, and standing outside, they sent to him and called him. A crowd was sitting around him, and they said to him, "Your mother and your brothers and sisters are outside asking for you." And he replied, "Who are my mother and my brothers?" And looking at those who sat around him, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is brother and sister and mother to me." May God bless these readings to our witness and to our faithfulness. Let us pray. O Lord God, pray that your Spirit would be upon us in the meditations of our hearts, in the words of my mouth, that all would be acceptable to you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. My father was an attorney. As an attorney, he served as executor in many estates. He was dismayed at how sometimes heirs could get into animated disputes, even adamant and bitter ones. My father was puzzled how families could get into a feud over who got the antique clock and who got the side table in the hallway. My father even said to me once, people will sacrifice a relationship, a long relationship with a relative or a family member, over a few china dishes and some sticks of furniture. You would think that family matters more than material possessions. My father believed that family matters more than anything else. And Jesus believes that too. Jesus believes that family matters. Jesus says, "Whoever does the will of God is like brother and sister and mother unto me." Family matters. Jesus goes on throughout his life and throughout his ministry to emphasize the fact that God reveals how the family of God matters. No one is to be left out, either by our doing or our lack of doing something. Biological and spiritual families are very important. And because family matters, one of the things I'm doing is updating my will. And the reason I'm doing it is because my children matter to me. And I want to see that there is a clear and equitable distribution of whatever material assets I have. Surely Jesus' impact upon us, upon our lives, suggests that we have something else that we can share spiritually too with those who love us and whom we care about. Bill Timaeus says so. Bill Timaeus was Kansas City's star religion editor and reporter for a number of years. Now retired, Bill gave a workshop at the Presbyterian over a year ago. And that workshop was entitled Writing a Spiritual Will. And there were 4 of us from here who attended his workshop. It was stimulating and challenging. Bill's contention is that all of us spend time seeing that we have a will for the distribution of our material possessions, yet we neglect to take time in writing our own spiritual will. Shouldn't we leave a statement that testifies to what we value, to the principles which we found most helpful guiding our living over the years spiritually? The emphasis is upon what you and me discover so far in our life as to be important. The most inspiring touchstones in our spiritual life. And we can do this at any point in our life, because a spiritual will is something that you can look back, 5 years from now, and you say, I want to add this. I want to change that. The assignment is simple yet challenging. One suggestion Bill made to us was that if you find a concept, try to illustrate it with a story or an anecdote. And as he made that suggestion, I began to get in touch gradually with what I considered my core beliefs, which I consider essential. It also made me increasingly curious about my ancestors and what kind of personal values and spiritual commitments guided their decision-making. I wondered practical things like, why did my great-grandparents, William and Janet Stewart, leave Brodick, Scotland, and immigrate all the way to America, to New York City, in the 1870s? And if I were to look deeper into their story, is it possible that I would be able to uncover some unwritten spiritual legacy that I might find they left behind? So last summer I went to Scotland, and I went to the village of Brodick on the Isle of Arran. I wanted to see if I could find out what prompted them to leave life near Brodick on the Isle of Arran for America. Why would anyone want to leave the Isle of Arran? I mean, it's called Scotland in miniature, folks. I mean, the Isle of Arran has compressed on this little island every charm, beauty, feature, facet, history. It has it all. Why would you leave paradise? I was blessed to find a genealogy department there that was staffed by volunteers at the Living History Museum in Brodick. They not only located the cemetery where my great-great-grandparents are buried, but they were able to identify on the survey map made in 1982 its exact location right next to a side door of the chapel. The cemetery is located 3 miles south of Brodick. It's an old fishing village that looks out over the sea called Lamlish. St. Mary's Cemetery is on a hill that overlooks the village of Lamlish. There is a chapel by my great-great-grandparents' grave that was built in 1603. Its roof gone and its walls a bit crumbling. Surrounding that chapel are monuments and gravestones. My great-great-grandparents' tall monument has 27 lines that are chiseled in stone, devoted to them, their children and spouses, and their grandchildren and their spouses. 40 years ago, those descendants of the Stewart family decided to erect this memorial upon the death of Catherine Jessie Stewart on September 15th, 1969, at the age of 86. They did it because family matters, because remembering family is important. And I realize on this Memorial Day weekend that as a child, I remember going with my parents and grandparents to cemeteries as flowers were placed upon the graves of relatives and loved ones on Memorial Day. So as I was standing in that Scottish mist at St. Mary's Cemetery that day, I realized I was embracing my family lineage in stone. I was reminded of my place in the continuity of the Stewart clan. This morning, however, the reading from Galatians, and particularly from the Gospel, is about how all of us are reminded that our heritage, our spiritual ties, and our continuity as Christians is in that larger global family that Jesus talks about throughout his ministry. Today, Jesus is talking about it when he says, "Whoever does the will of God is brother and sister and mother to me." Do you grasp how Jesus is inviting us, challenging us to do the will of God? While you and I can appreciate what our ancestors did, we can admire their personal values and their spiritual commitments, but the real question for us this morning is, what kind of spiritual legacy will you and me leave behind? And there are different ways to do that, and one of those ways is to write down some of our thoughts, as well as our actions, attitudes, and decision-making that we make every day. Two men were walking to their cars following a graveside service for a close friend and professional colleague. And one man turned to the other and said, "Mike, how much do you think Fred left behind?" Mike thought for a moment, turned to him and said, "He left all of it." He left all of it. We know that in our head. We leave it all behind. Not only our material possessions, but we also leave a spiritual legacy and the remembrance of our actions and our attitudes and our choices made. And we can leave something behind that is a written spiritual will. And I believe that spiritual will can have more wisdom and more value than all the material possessions we catalog and distribute. I'm going back to Scotland this summer. I want to see Glasgow, and I want to see some of the art that's there. I want to see the area around Glasgow, and I want to spend some time on the Isle of Arran. And that's what I'm going to do the last week I'm there. Oh yes, I'm going to go to the genealogy department, and I may climb Mount Grossfeld and hike through the ravines and those clear stream brooks that take you all the way to those ancient pagan sites with the standing stones. And I will probably find myself to those caves where Scottish patriots hid out from those English ships that were patrolling in search of them. For sure, I am going to try to learn more about my ancestors' lives. One of the things I've already learned is the possibility that they lived in fear and dread that at any time there could be another Scottish potato famine, reminiscent of the one that lasted for 3 years. It is also likely that their lives dramatically changed when the Duke of Hamilton, who controlled and, quote, owned, unquote, the island, decided that he was going to transform farming life forever on the Isle of Arran by one decision. He decided that instead of 10 families farming a plot of land, there would be 2. Instead of collecting rent from 10 families, he would collect the same amount of rent from 2. Obviously, the consequences was that the 2 families had more land to raise crops on and to return the major portion to the Duke, and they would also pay rent on the land. For those who were not chosen by the Duke of Hamilton for the privilege of renting farmland that they had done before for generation upon generation upon generation, it meant that they had no close food source nor a skimpy annual income. History records it cost money to immigrate. Those who could not immigrate were homeless in some instances and stuck on Arran. History records that those who were without rental land survived for the next 3 or 4 years by the grace and the generosity of those who had been chosen by the Duke to rent land from him. They did it because family matters. They did this because they were family. Family as villagers of Lamleash. Family as neighbors of Brodick. Neighbors that had been on that island for generation after generation after generation after generation. It is possible they took care of one another because they knew it was what God expected them to do. We are having trouble in America sometimes grasping that a person is not defined by their color, their ethnicity, or their cultural heritage. Yet more citizens have joined hate groups since Barack Obama became president 7 years ago than in the years preceding. Significantly, dramatically have increased. From Maine to Arizona. The resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan in the United States for the past 7 years is for the same reason as it existed before. The Ku Klux Klan sees an America where power and personal freedom is reserved for whites only. We're having trouble sometimes in America grasping that the American family is much larger than ourselves and much more diverse. My father proudly served in the Army Air Corps in World War II. He taught in the classroom, and he took, as he said, I took soldiers up and learned and taught them how they could be pilots, airmen. He said that at that time, people had been taught for generations that blacks were intellectually inferior. Leaders, military leaders in particular, assumed that black airmen were not smart enough nor skilled enough to actually fly planes in combat. And my dad said, yet when it came to the moment that they absolutely had to be pressed into service, he said those black airmen had a stellar record. Our belief in freedom for all, for which so many sacrificed their lives in wartime, of all color and creed, our belief in freedom for all is always going to be at risk when it is being tarnished and even dismantled by those who tolerate and even promote fear and hatred of others. Everyone matters from the perspective of the whole people of God. Everyone matters. It's not the will of God to believe that a person of a particular color or ethnic group is more favored than others. Everyone, from the view of the whole people of God, matters. My great-grandfather, William Stewart, experienced how the whole people of God stand up and do what's right. My great-grandfather, William, experienced this caring. He trusted people of faith would care for his children when he was no longer able to do it by himself. You see, there was a depression toward the end of the 19th century. It was a depression that swept across our country. It affected everything. He lost his job as a postal carrier. He lost his job as a painter, and the only job he had that left was being a night clerk at a hotel. He had held those 3 jobs for all of his life in New York City. 4 years earlier, my great-grandmother, his wife, died in the hospital in New York City of tuberculosis. And for 4 years, he raised his family of 7 children by himself. But when the Depression came, it was impossible. But family matters. 4 of his cousins took in his 3 daughters and his youngest son on the East Coast. So they were scattered about, but welcomed and taken in because family matters. Family cares. Then my great-grandfather, had to make that tough decision. He entrusted my grandfather Alex and his brother Robert to the care of the Children's Missionary Aid Society of New York City. He did this so that his sons could be relocated west of New York City, off the streets and out of the tenement apartments. They would go west and be placed on a farm, because you see what happened at that time was ministers and civic leaders, they got together and they looked at the 35,000 children that were on the streets of New York City at that time, and they said, there's got to be a better way. We can't ignore this. We can't just let this linger on. These children are going to die slowly, either by starvation or by violence. So they organized the orphan train. The orphan train was an effort to provide a fresh start for my grandfather and his brother Robert. My grandfather William then made the tough decision to take his eldest son James and the two of them headed west, far west, a trek that would be repeated in the Depression of the 30s when you went west to pick oranges in the orchards. At the first farm my grandfather Alex was placed that received him, he experienced the kindness of a person who cared about his future. And it wasn't the family who took him in. No, it was the social worker who came out of Kansas City on behalf of the Children's Missionary Society of New York City. That man came to Holden, Missouri. He came out near Holden, Missouri to the farm, and what he discovered was, as he went to the schoolhouse, first off, how is Alexander Stewart doing in school? And the school teacher said, who? He said, Alex Stewart. I don't have anybody enrolled here by that name. And that social worker turned right around and went to that foster family and told them to pack up Alex Stewart's belongings, that they had broken their promise, their pledge, to send him to school every day. And instead, for the past 4 weeks he was in their care, they were using him full time to do farm chores. At the second farm, my grandfather Alex experienced a couple who cared about his future. Mr. and Mrs. Phelps of Holden, Missouri, saw that he went to school and got an education. They also took him to the First Presbyterian Church of Holden, Missouri, every Sunday. He worshiped there with Mr. and Mrs. Holden and their 3 daughters, and enjoyed hymns that he would love singing the rest of his life. Family matters. It can be a foster family, biological family, family of faith. What have you found to be most helpful in your spiritual life that you would like to share with those who love and care about you? Jesus is always, I think, seeking to draw us closer to Him, and He's always trying to come toward us. Whoever does the will of God is brother and sister and mother to me. Jesus expects us to approach people rather than to avoid them or ignore them. Jesus expects us to let love and compassion be our guide and not fear. Jesus wants us to turn our back on hate and violence, for it is toxic to the whole family of God. There has got to be a better way, and there is if we look for it. There's got to be a better way. Listen carefully to this poet's spiritual testimonial for a better way. He drew a circle that shut me out. Heretic, rebel, a thing to flout. But love and I had the wit to win. We drew a circle that took him in. Those lines were written by Edward Markham over 80 years ago. They still live on. They have an impact. What you have to share in your spiritual will can have impact. What you have to share in your spiritual will can have impact because it will always be personal and real in the hands of those who love and care about you. And it will be your faith gift to them. Whether your spiritual will is 2 paragraphs or 3 pages and counting does not matter. What matters is that your spiritual will can be an opportunity to remind others who stood with you throughout your life and what you sought to stand for in your life. Your spiritual will can be that opportunity to remind others who stood with you and what you sought to stand for. Because, as Jesus says, family matters. Whoever does the will of God is brother and sister and mother to me.